We begin with the discussion panel, and we have Professor Binu Mukherjee who will be chairing the session. We have Sraddhalu and AUROBINDO who will be entertaining questions for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I must say, of course, that first of all, that I have really had much more time than my colleagues here. Don't lift it. And my colleagues have not, so I think I'd rather leave the floor to them to say, I think I've exhausted what I would like to tell you. And I see that there are two questions here, which we have been asked to deal with. What is Sri Aurobindo's vision for the future of science in general? And what is the extent and nature of the usefulness of science in the discovery of the higher levels of consciousness? My own feeling is that we should field questions after the other two have spoken. So I would ask perhaps Sraddhalu to lead, and then Alok, and then we'll come back to see what you have to say. Here.
There were two aspects of Sri Aurobindo's vision for the future of science, one of which I would like to read out from part of his commentary on the Upanishads, where he describes how science increasingly comes close to the Vedantic view and experience. And he concludes that part saying, this which science proves, says the Vedantist, is precisely what is meant by Maya. But then he tells us what's next. Never dream, however, that science will end here and that we have come to the last of her unveilings. She will yet go on and tell us that the cosmic ether itself is only an image. So science has come to the point where it recognizes a substratum ether. You call it by any term, zero-point energy or zero-point field or ether, most simply. But even that is a first level of reality. So he says, she will yet go on and tell us that the cosmic ether itself is only an image, that this universe of sensible things and things inferable from sense is only a selection of translations from a far vaster universe, of forms built out of a subtle matter than our senses can now show or imply to us. And when she has entered into that subtle world with fit instruments of observation and analysis, that too she will relentlessly resolve into mere images of the subtler ether out of which it is born. So the second level of reality is of a subtle matter, subtle senses, all the range of the subtle world, whose understanding today is popularly known as occultism. Unfortunately, occultism in popular understanding, and unfortunately the practice also, has been reduced to just machinery of magic. But from the way Sri Aurobindo approaches it, he says, it is intended to be a knowledge of these inner domains and an experience of these domains, even as we develop knowledge and experience of the outer domains. But this inner domain is supported by a subtle substratum, subtler ether, of which the physical ether is itself a further projection. But this subtle world having been understood, you can go back a third level, he says, out of which the subtle emerges. And he says, therefore, behind that subtler universe also there looms a profounder and vaster but simpler state of existence, where there is only the undetermined universality of things as yet involved in their causes. Here science must come to her latest dealings with matter and show us that this indeterminate universality of things is after all only an image of something in our own self. And so the circle completes, as Alok pointed out, and we come back to our own deepest self, our own identity, etc. Now in all this, the place of consciousness is obvious, and Sri Aurobindo has written much about it. We popularly understand the equation energy equals mass. But that's only the first level of reality which our ancients also recognized when they said that all this universe is the product of Shakti, energy. But then they went further. The energy itself, they said, is conscious energy, Chit Shakti. And it is by conscious free will that this energy whirls to unfold the patterns that we see. And those patterns which we call the laws of nature are nothing but her habits, chosen by her free choice consciously. And this domain, as we cross beyond energy, recognizing consciousness as the origin and basis of energy itself, will open up new dimensions, for which, again, in this text, it's a very deep text, where he says, when we have developed fit instruments of observation and analysis, and elsewhere in one of his discussions, he describes how the present instruments of observation and analysis of science fail when we enter the occult domain. And the requirement for that domain is different. Different sets of instruments are required. So this is one side of his vision for the future of science. The other side is in the Life Divine, where he gives an interesting observation that the present thrust of science is to focus on distinctions. When you see two different things, two different objects, two different materials, two different processes, the whole focus of science instinctively is, what's the difference? How is this different from that? And through the study of differences, we have developed the bulk of the knowledge that we have of science. But then Sri Aurobindo says the liberating knowledge will come when we study the common elements, not the differences. What is it that makes these two similar, although they appear different? And you go back to the essentiality of their commonness. And this, he says, will take science to its greatest realization, greatest achievements. And the final mastery of science will be through this process, when any material will be transmutable into any other material. This will be the ultimate mastery of matter. You can take a piece of iron and turn it into gold, etc. But this is only possible when you get back to that essentiality which is common in all things. And here again the suggestion is pointing to that substratum ether, which is conscious energy. Here I touch upon an interesting aspect of the ether. Sri Aurobindo describes it as an electrical substratum, and there were two quotations which I tried to gather a few. One which is very provocative and very firm in its declaration in the Life Divine, written in 1916, when already quantum mechanics had crept in and special relativity had thrown out the ether. And he says, ether may and does exist as an intangible, almost spiritual support of matter, but as a phenomenon, it does not seem to our present knowledge, at least, to be materially detectable. So suggesting that we will be able to detect it, and as I pointed out earlier, it has been detected in many ways, including certain latest satellite measurements, in which we are able to detect that there is an absolute direction, even in the pattern of the cosmic radiation. It's not evenly spread. There is an absolute direction. And in communicating with satellites, we do experience certain phenomena which can only be explained in terms of an ether lag. The second quotation which I pull out from one of his earlier writings, where he says, ether, not fire, is the first principle ignored by the Greeks, but rediscovered by modern science. And then Sri Aurobindo inserts a footnote there. Now again rejected, though that does not seem to be indubitable or final. So he's recognizing that science has rejected it, but that's not the final thing. Well, we'll come back to it in a different form. In ether, in his other writings in the Life Divine, there is this explanation of what the ether itself represents. It is, and I put it very simplistically, it is the expansion of consciousness itself and the relations consciousness sets with itself, which becomes the first basis of this expansion of space, time, ether, etc. So you see here also the link with consciousness, and the moment you're able to touch material processes down to consciousness through the ether, you have bridged physical science, occult science, and spiritual science.
Actually, there are so many ways of looking at the same thing. To my little understanding, science, technology is an extension of whatever consciousness is extending it in this way. I mean, human science is not only with human beings, there is a science at all levels. And it is an extension of the consciousness. So I suppose to place science as being the thrust that would bring about an evolutionary change is probably to expect too much out of that. Like any, it's a byproduct of evolution, and like any byproduct, it will help. Any byproduct helps in the process. But the evolutionary necessity is within us. It's in the conscious seeking, the same life divine, the aspiration. And it is with that conscious seeking and the conscious aspiration which may come about in several ways. If I look at science, for instance, one may be dissatisfied with the way science is. Like in 60s, the evolutionary wave came simply because human beings felt utterly, something within them felt that, look, the kind of paradigm, the kind of world order in which we live based on science and industry is not enough. Something within broke an inner wall, and people started experimenting, a whole lot of experiments, and as a result of it today, I think it's a fallout of largely of those early wanderings that people have come to really discuss or understand the possibilities of other dimensions. So even many of scientific discoveries have been very intuitive. We have a whole lot of examples. So to my inner perception, the whole crux of the matter lies in man's evolution, and preferably consciously. So long as the data that we receive from the senses is limited, any talk of higher worlds will remain largely a matter of conjecture or speculation. Because eventually it is only, as Sri Aurobindo says, when you can see the soul as you see a physical object in space, that is the real solution. Otherwise, you know, we can always deduce and infer. But deductions and inferences are not technically strictly science, because, you know, the very first thing is observation. And we don't have the power to observe. In science, the limited observation of human faculties is augmented by external instruments. So we have the microscope and the telescope, but these instruments extend only in physical space. They do not extend into the inner spaces because they have the limitations. Certain kind of instruments came like Killian photography and crystallography, etc. But they really register some kind of phenomena, and very difficult to go by those instruments. But there is another kind of instruments which we have. The first instruments are our senses, and yogic experience and spirituality that has developed along many lines affirms that corresponding to these gross physical senses, there are subtle senses, and they are the subtlest of the subtle sense. And these senses, originally that's the only sense, but they are drugged in matter sleep. So if they can be awakened through a process of yoga, and I use yoga here in a most general sense, widest possible sense of the term, through any means, once these senses awaken, or simply as a result of the pressure of the evolutionary consciousness, we may well have children who right from childhood experience reality in different ways than, well, a generation before experienced it. I see that happening already. And once that experience comes into the domain of mainstream human thought, then there would be next level that, well, let's understand what it is, and, you know, science will evolve as a result of that experience. So essential thing is that if we can consciously evolve the faculties by which we can meet these inner worlds, and the key that is given everywhere repeatedly in Sri Aurobindo's yoga and in all yogic lore is to first get out of this cage of matter in which we are so heavily bound, and then discover the deeper psychic reality and look at this world from that angle where all these inner worlds meet. In fact, one of the distinguishing features of the Superman the mother describes is that he will have this knowledge of the inner worlds almost like an innately. He will be born with it. He will be having it very naturally, just as we look at this outer world of cognizable objects. So these inner worlds, whether this science as it is today can really lead us to that, I have my doubts. If at all, it will be through maybe lot of mazes, and many blunders. But there is another way, that if human consciousness evolves and we have the hard data, simply because we are able to experience things in another way, then there would be a much simpler way. That's how I see the future and the understanding of the higher consciousness and the hidden worlds. So we must evolve. The second problem of science is too much dependence on reason and analysis. And I think at some level, as one grows, one begins to first experience intuition, and then one begins to see that this intuition actually corresponds to certain facts. One intuitivizes things and finds them to be true and real. So that kind of science has to develop, much like the Vedic period, where each one grew into a certain line of experience and put it into a text. Now this not a mental thought, it's an inspiration or an intuition. That's why the Vedas don't belong to anybody in particular, though there are rishis who have composed the Vedic hymns. They are facts of inner experience which the rishis received. So if we can grow into the next step, that is the intuitive cycle, then very naturally this dependent on rational analysis, because as we have just read, it's a very inconclusive toil. We can pick up the same data. I mean, I can do it. These are mind games all of us, I'm sure, have played, that we can pick up a data, same, exactly identical data, and we can prove it this way and prove it that way. Absolutely identical, and I think many persons here have played that game and know this very well. But what if the data changes? Thing is that, it should not be based on rational analysis and inference, but on a direct perception and intuition. The seers saw the truth. They did not deduce it. The third problem is where science can help is that so far science has moved on the assumption that matter is the sole reality. And I think that assumption is breaking apart. Even the statistical way of approach is breaking apart, because there is something which has come in the field of psychology called autoethnography. So sometime back, an experience was invalid unless a large number of people experienced it. But now science is admitting, at least psychological science, that even if one person has experienced something, it has its validity. But only thing is that it has to be understood, explained, further research. But it's not regarded as something invalid simply because it's not the mass of human experience. And I think that's a very big step forward. So it's beginning to admit the subjective side of life. One problem of science is that it deals with the measurables, whereas the most beautiful things of life are immeasurable. The sense of beauty, for instance, how do you measure it? Of course, you can make a mathematics out of it, but something will always escape. The divine, immeasurable. Love, immeasurable. Knowledge itself, immeasurable. Wisdom, how do you quantify wisdom? So some of the most important things of life which add to the perfume of life remain beyond the purview of the measurable sciences. And the moment we enter into the domain of qualitative experience or the subjective experience, science which has followed so far the material footsteps fails. Let me conclude with a small little, it's a real story, not the mythical story, which are more real, of course. In 1900, there was a meeting of the Science Congress, the Royal College of Physicians, where Lord Kelvin made a very proud declaration that there are only two clouds in the field of science, and we are very soon going to resolve it, and that will explain everything in the universe. So these two clouds, of course, were black body radiation, and there was another about the movement of stars in space. So it was believed that based on Newtonian mechanics, everything can be explained, and these two were the only inexplicable ponderables. Now Max Planck in the same year came up with a theory explaining the black body radiation, and Einstein with the other one, the movement of stars. And both these theories strangely undid the entire Newtonian world. So it's valid within its own range, it's not undone. But it brought in a totally new paradigm shift. So it's very difficult to say what new data may emerge tomorrow in the future and change the entire face of things. So that line in Savitri, that a sudden turn may come, a road appear, a touch can alter the fixed front of fate, or a greater mind may see a greater truth. So these are the three possibilities. One, suddenly the anomalous begins to increase and there is an urge to explain it. Unfortunately, all the biological and psychological sciences followed the footstep of physical sciences, because the physical sciences really did very well at one point of time. And that, I think, was a sad state of affairs, because by its very nature they are different. For instance, in physical science there is a fixed play of forces. So if I throw a stone, I can almost predict If I know all the variables where it is going to land, whether it will land on somebody's glass pane or my own head, I can predict. But if a crow flies, even if I have all the data, I cannot say where it's going to land. Because there is a very crucial element missing, the intent of the crow. Now this is something which goes beyond the purview of the understanding of science. Similarly, there is no way I can know what's going on in somebody else's mind, because it's another domain. So it's very good that psychological sciences are beginning to disabuse themselves from this hard drudgery of the pure measurable statistical form of materialistic science. This is the very first beautiful step, and this must be encouraged, because till some time back, even psychological experiences, there was an effort to understand them only on the basis, psychological, why psychological, even spiritual experiences, only on the basis of hard materialistic paradigm. And that's an old world, and it's collapsing everywhere. Now it's in mainstream, this is accepted that there is a subjective side of reality, and we need to study it in its own way. So there has to be people who document the subjective side of their experiences, and when these experiences abound and multiply, then we may have some access to the hidden worlds and the higher consciousness. This is my take on that. And there could be so many other. So, any questions?
Should we ask for the questions from the audience?
No, just a minute. I'll have my 2 cents worth on this. When one asks about the future of science, I presume one is talking about the long-term future here. We simply don't know. The answer is very simple. We don't know. Science is, at the moment, is handicapped by the situation in which the mind exists. I read to you today Sri Aurobindo's take on how the mind can develop. As we develop, I personally believe that the development will be harmonious. As the mind develops, science too will develop. As I pointed out with Sri Aurobindo's use of the doctors, I think divine will also use science. And we have no idea now how this will come. I fail to see much sense in trying to predict what will come in the future. What we have to do is to develop ourselves. When we come to the point, we will know what development is taking place. We do not have the equipment needed now to see what will come in the future. As we proceed in our development, we will see what developments take place. At that point of time, we will know how things are and how things are changing. But I believe that they will all develop in parallel, and science will have its place just as mind has its place. But the science might be very different from what we know science to be today. So it's also a matter of definition here. But I really fail to see the great desire to predict what will happen in the future, because we simply do not have any instruments to predict what will happen in the future. And we ought to be modest enough to know that. Okay, now let's have any questions.
As Sraddhaluji has told about occult senses and occult knowledge, and then I am having one question about our ancient sciences. It is Ayurveda, that Nadi Shastra is all there, even palmistry is there. The all sciences are helping for health and solving out some problem. So nowadays, these all sciences are in the hands of fraud. People are just earning money. Any corner we are seeing some health center of Siddhas and this all. So why, who are following the yoga of Sri Aurobindo and Mother, they are not researching over these sciences. And particularly a person, dedicated person like Alokji is there. I don't know our because he is so much worried about patient and sincere, and so if we feel we want integrality and to develop something occult senses and that, then what about our science, ancient science of our India, this whole Ayurveda? And I am having the background of this Ayurveda, So please, anything you are doing or anything, you please tell us.
We'll answer that. I'll ask Alok to answer it, but I just wanted to say, if you try and please keep your question short. Okay, you want to answer it? Go ahead.
The problem with many of these sciences, Ayurveda, palmistry, even astrology, is that they were not sciences based on a rational pursuit, but by an intuitive insight. If today we apply our rational mind to try to improve upon them, we will very likely break them apart and make a mess of it, which has happened also. So to be able to develop them further would require at first recovering that state of consciousness out of which the rishis expressed that body of knowledge. Of course, one can take cues from there and try to do some other experimentation, but it would not add significantly to that domain of knowledge. This is the problem with the intuitive domains of knowledge. I wouldn't call them sciences yet, that's a matter of definition.
Yes, absolutely so. In Ramayana, the story of Sushen who gets the Sanjeevani booty, you may be remembering it. So, he says that it's not enough just to get the booty, he adds something of his own into it. So these are very intuitive sciences, and I think the first stress has to be developed to that level where one can really relate with them. So plants have a consciousness, and we cannot deal with them just casually the way we deal today in allopathy, that as if they are unconscious stuff. So if we take that point of view, there is a new science, science of consciousness. Sri Aurobindo has spoken about it, that in the future there will be a science of consciousness. Now this science of consciousness will bring tremendous possibilities. So we deal with everything consciously, so much so that this bit of water can be picked up and charged. There are already such things going around the net about that, famous Japanese experiment. So can this water be charged and given and heal a person? It's possible. It's possible absolutely scientifically. But then, if today we try to do it, because it has to be charged with that kind of consciousness. So a consciousness-based approach will bring many, many possibilities in the field of science. But first task is for us to evolve. And once that happens, and it is happening in every field. People, as they're evolving, they're bringing in new things. Well, as you said, in the field of Ayurveda, a new understanding and a new light.
Yeah, and
Yes.
this is for the chair. Somewhere in your talk, you talked about the extremity of science and the spirituality taken to its extreme, and then a synthesis to understand truth. Now, I just wanted to know what
That was a quotation from the mother, I believe.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I wanted to know what defines this extremity, because you also said that the mind, if it knows its limitation, it's very good. The science is really kind of developing. If the mind knows its limitation, so if I know my limitation, is it that it's my extreme point? But the most important question is for Sraddhalu here. This is my real personal favorite because I'm working on it. Can I call Sri Aurobindo's philosophy as panpsychism by any chance?
Sorry, what word?
Panpsychism. Because ether has come back with a bang. And it's now all pervading. So can I say an object has consciousness as well? If it has, can it on its own, I mean to say morphogenetically develop, totally divorced from what I think about what it is going to do? So it has its own life. So when I ask this question, can I say that Aurobindo was a panpsychic? Does it by any chance mean that I can get Aurobindo's thought away from human-centric? Life will be a different life altogether. If an object can have its own consciousness, I need not really interfere. As a human or as an anthropocentric personality, I need not really interfere with what's happening there.
Well, what the mother has said, of course, is that consciousness was inherent in matter. If it was not, then we could not have developed in the way we have. All future possibilities were inherent in matter, even the possibilities that have to come in the future. The technicalities of what you are asking, I don't know the answer, and I don't know whether it's terribly important either. You see, in the other thing that I also wanted to add with regard to this, when we think of what is coming in the future, think back to the monkey. Would the monkey have been able to predict where we are today? It would not have been able to predict. We have simply no idea of what is coming. So when it will come, we will enjoy that knowledge. and we will go on from there. But that is, I think, the sort of state we are in now compared to the evolution that is to come. But does anybody else want to answer this specific question?
Yes, Sri Aurobindo has spoken about this panpsychicization part which you are referring to. I forget where it is, but it's in one of his early writings on science. Having said that, it's true that each object has its own consciousness, which is the common substratum. But it's equally true that each of these separate seemings are interlinked in a sense of oneness. So we have to find that meeting point where this multiplicity and this oneness finds its most harmonious equation, if I may say so. And that would be the most perfect science. So each has its consciousness, and it's very true that we have a very anthropomorphic view of things. And that's a great, great problem in understanding this cosmos.
Yes, I have a question. I'm sorry, I think it will interrupt the subject. But Professor, you, when you spoke a question raised in my mind, you said that receiving the books from Sri Aurobindo, the idea was just to read it and to didn't have anybody explaining it, what was in the book. So I just discovered this institution yesterday, SACAR, who seems to propose explanation about Sri Aurobindo. There are in this room few or many teachers and who are giving explanation about Sri Aurobindo and the Mother's teaching. So, what's up?
I can only, what I have said to you was my personal interaction with the mother, and therefore I have followed that. Quite often, mother, in fact, used to give different answers to different people, depending very much on what their soul needed. I cannot generalize from what I know, but it certainly, I can only tell you what I have been told. And another thing in respect to this is that when I was in the UK and I was a member of the original London Centre, the original London Sri Aurobindo Centre, I came and asked Mother about how we proceed in our meetings. And again, she had emphasized to me that we should only read together, that there should be no explanation and no discussion to follow that, except because there were a number of people whose English was not strong enough to perhaps open the dictionary and find the meanings of words that Sri Aurobindo has used. And she was quite emphatic to me about that. So it is not really proper for me to say something about anything else, but at the same time, she might have given other people different advice. And therefore that is not right for me. It is also true that they're not physically present now. I don't know, perhaps the needs may have changed. I don't know. I don't feel that, and I can only give that as my personal point of view.
I'd like to comment on this question because it's so central to why we're sitting here and talking all this. The mother did allow teachers in the ashram school to teach, so to say. But she constantly emphasized the importance of developing the personal contact directly with the source of the inspiration that the book represents. On the other hand, Sri Aurobindo himself, when he wrote in the Arya, intended to be accessible to the human mind and to the human intellect in particular. So there are writings which are aimed at the intellect directly and therefore are meant to be understood in a rational framework and therefore are open to rational discussion also. And yet, behind that first contact through the intellect, there was this higher intuition and still higher inspiration of a higher power, which infuses it, which, if the mind is first touched through the intellect, may also be touched unconsciously at first and later more consciously. Now, in the ashram and especially in the centers connected, there was a special emphasis to aim at that highest first. But in an academic framework, you may or may not give that too much importance, depending on the individual who's studying. If a person chooses just to do a PhD for the sake of a PhD, well, he will just address it at an intellectual level and stop there. Whereas somebody else may take that up and use it as a gateway to enter into something higher and even experience the thing which is intended.
Well, gentlemen, I think as you refer to SACAR, and I'm responsible for it, I think it's my duty to answer. Yes, as Binu said, mother has said different things to different persons. And this entire business started with my father in 1964, when she gave to my father an institution called Institute of Human Study, wherein my father had started with two definite diploma, post-diploma courses. They're called PG diploma courses, if you understand what it means in Indian context. And he had said it's an integral course in integral philosophy and a course in integral education. And he said very clearly they are diploma courses meant for 1 year, to which the mother signed her blessings. And then not only that, then there was one course held in integral philosophy in which I myself took part as one of the teachers. And at the end of the session, there were 24 students who all of them came into Pondicherry, and she, being the president of Institute of Human Study, she gave the certificate that this gentleman has passed this integral education course conducted by Institute of Human Study. President, the mother signed. So you see, she encouraged us at Hyderabad to conduct specific courses in different thoughts of Sri Aurobindo, different vision of Sri Aurobindo. It is SACAR is an inspiration from that Institute of Human Study, which is a parent body at Hyderabad. So we, as part of the development of the Institute of Human Study, we decided in 1990 that we will have a branch of advanced research in Pondicherry. Our institute has started different centers at Jangaon and other places, but Pondicherry was selected for a higher research. So it's an extension of what the mother had foreseen and also granted her approval and a permission to conduct and teach courses. And one certificate is in one of my own books, where the mother gave the same certificate to my own father. And that certificate, I have even published it in one of the books. So you see, we cannot, as Binu rightly said, we cannot generalize what Mother and Sri Aurobindo have said to one person. And to me personally, again she said, "De tipo compte sur mes bénédictions pour comprendre Savitri dans sa signification magnifique et profonde." Comprendre. As she said, you can depend on me to understand. So again, that's where my inspiration lies behind SACAR. That if she has given me that blessings to understand, and she said, "Tipo compte sur moi." If she says that, then I said, I have got her blessings to conduct this understanding. Compte sur moi pour comprendre, pas pour réaliser, mais pour comprendre. So this is where my inspiration was there, that with her blessings, I should be able to so-called, as Sraddhalu rightly put it, not mentally teach, but allow her to teach through me, allow her to speak through me. And this is my personal sadhana and yoga, that how I be transparent to her inspiration and consciousness. It's with this attempt that all my colleagues have told them, let's not mentalize Sri Aurobindo. Even on our online teaching, we have lots and lots of original texts of Sri Aurobindo. We ask the student to read, to raise questions, to have a dialogue and a discussion. And my insistence with my colleagues, Larry and Belu and others, that let the student discover. We will be, that's why we don't call ourselves even teachers. We call ourselves facilitators in the true sense of what Mother has told us. So we are only trying to facilitate the understanding that the student comes to Sri Aurobindo. So SACAR is not proposing to teach Sri Aurobindo for information. I personally have a guidance, and then as an institution we have a guidance at Hyderabad, and then we are calling ourselves facilitators, and we are very aware. So let's not think that we are away from what the Mother has taught or what the Mother willed. So she has different way of giving to each a work for his own development. So for me, SACAR is a personal inner development. It's not just a teaching. So I'm growing inwardly to SACAR work. And so are my colleagues. Well, I hope I've been clear enough.
Maybe just to throw in a fine point in addition, there is also the question of the competence of the teacher. I had shared this thing with, I had met Dr. Kirit Joshi when he was head of the Indian Council of Philosophical Research. And I asked him, why haven't you introduced the life divine into the courses in India's universities? Because he had the power to do that. He said, you know, if I were to do that, it would be ripped apart by the most undeveloped minds making the most absurd statements and interpretations, not understanding the real thing. It's better to keep it in its pristine state and let people who are more developed and open to it access it as that capacity develops. So at that time I didn't understand it, but today I can understand what he meant. And I have found, unfortunately, within the last 2 years, there are websites which have taken quotations from Sri Aurobindo's Life Divine and deconstructed them in what they call postmodernist deconstruction and ended up with conclusions which are exactly the contrary of what Sri Aurobindo states and declared that as Sri Aurobindo's perspective. So that's the kind of stupidity that the human mind is capable of. So I would like to point out the question of competence of the teacher, especially if a teacher can consciously use that process of sharing or facilitating as a means of his own growth in consciousness and developing a deeper perception that can assist the student also to open to that higher possibility.
I think we've overrun our time, have we not? So that we should really stop here. There are others who have to come and speak. Thank you very much.